stumbled across his perfect match online.
Andrea is a beautiful woman, and there was great chemistry.
But behind Andrea Stanley's charismatic smile was a malicious secret.
We couldn't believe that this was actually happening.
You just can't predict what crazy people will do.
And one night, Jason would come face to face with true evil when he found himself in a fight like no other.
It takes an exceptionally cruel person to commit a crime like that.
I'm just so glad I can be here for my boys.
When it comes to love and marriage, things aren't always as they seem. 32-year-old bachelor Jason Witt appeared to have it all.
I had just finished up my MBA. I had just landed a job with a very good IT consulting firm and was doing really well. I was traveling almost every other week.
But by the summer of 2005, Jason realized one thing was missing: love.
I had come to this realization that I had probably dated a few girls in my past that I could have made a wonderful life with. My own level of commitment didn't allow that relationship to move forward.
He would talk about, what can I do better? How can he make himself a good match for someone?
As Jason plunged back into the dating scene, he was determined to get it right. That August, he joined an online dating site and quickly came across the profile of an attractive 24-year-old medical technician named Andrea Stanley.
Just shot her a quick note, just to say, hi, how are you? I'm Jason. And got a response pretty quick.
The conversations that followed revealed clear chemistry.
Andrea had a very engaging writing style. She made me laugh from the get-go. We had an easy time bantering back and forth, so it was enjoyable just talking to her, even though I hadn't heard her voice.
Despite Jason's initial excitement, he did have one concern.
I had never dated someone with a child. Knowing that she had a daughter, I had some questions. I didn't know what that meant in terms of any custody issues.
But Jason didn't have to worry about the father at all. On their first in-person date a few weeks later, Andrea opened up about her past.
There was an ease to our conversation that was really nice and refreshing. So I asked her, where's the father? And her response to me was, I was raped.
He's in jail and he's not a part of her life.
When I heard her say that then, it came out so strong, like such a survivor. It was really impressive.
As the date wrapped up, Jason knew one thing was certain.
There's no doubt it was a great date, and I definitely wanted to see her again.
As 2005 came to a close, their relationship continued to blossom.
We were just kind of taking the natural steps that you'd expect in any serious relationship.
We couldn't be happier.
Me too.
They got along well. She shared his sense of humor. They enjoyed each other's company. That did give me the feeling that they were right for each other.
Then one night in February 2006, Andrea delivered some unexpected news.
There was an uncomfortable silence, and she simply said, I have something to say. She seemed scared to tell me, and she said,
I'm pregnant.
I was obviously surprised, and I didn't want to make any decisions quickly.
It'll be fine.
But soon it became clear that Andrea wanted answers.
After probably a week and a half, she started asking me questions.
What's up, Jason? It's been 2 weeks.
I said, I am committed to you. I love you. We will have this baby together. Let's see how you and I do, and then we can make decisions that will impact this child long term.
Just one step at a time.
Her response was, either we're getting married or we're not. Getting married when she was showing was not an option. Here was that moment to say yes or no. The decision came down to, yes, I'm in love with her, so I want to marry her.
Jason knew in his heart he was making the right decision. But before Jason could even pop the question, he would be thrown into a vortex of lies, deceit, and manipulation that would destroy everything he believed in.
He was just caught in this whirlwind of emotion
I can't imagine how someone can keep such a deep, dark secret.
I didn't know what to do, and that's what just scared the dickens out of me.
In April 2006, Jason Witt couldn't be happier to be in love with Andrea Stanley, the future mother of his first child. But that joy was soon shattered when Jason received a distressing call from Andrea while on the road.
She was distraught, she was upset, and she's just, I don't know what's going on.
I lost the baby.
It was devastating, and that just made me worried for her.
Still, Jason knew what he wanted to do for the woman he loved.
I knew I still felt the way I did about her. I still loved her. I created a get-well bag. At the bottom was a diamond ring she says she had always hoped for.
It's my ring.
Will you marry me?
It was kind of a neat moment to recommit to the two of us.
With the ring on her finger, Andrea quickly bounced back and set a whirlwind date for 2 months later. But by the day of their nuptials, it seemed Andrea had morphed into a classic bridezilla.
She was texting me all kinds of things. She was going to leave me at the altar, and I was a horrible person, and I just didn't know what to do. I felt that she had been under a tremendous amount of stress. She was coming off losing a baby, so I gave her the benefit of the doubt.
I tried to just be positive for Jason and, look forward to a beautiful wedding that day. And fingers crossed that Andrea was actually going to show up.
In the end, Andrea did show up, and the wedding went off without a hitch. But over the next few months, it seemed to Jason that Andrea had a flair for the dramatic.
We had some ups and downs, which I felt was normal. What made me a little bit nervous was one fight in particular. She was just off the roof, angry, and within minutes, turned around like nothing had just happened. It was a real Jekyll and Hyde moment.
Then one night in January 2007, Andrea reached a new low.
Why didn't you respond to my text messages?
I had no idea what was going on. So I started questioning her, why are we always fighting? Where is this coming from? And Andrea started describing her depression.
Jason, I just want to die.
What? I was concerned that she was suffering, having lost a child. I wanted to get her help.
I just want to kill myself.
Jason felt even worse after Andrea revealed that the anniversary of her rape was fast approaching.
We'll get you someone to talk to.
It's too late.
But a few weeks later, Andrea's spirits were lifted.
We find out we were going to have another baby, and we started seeing a doctor, and we knew she was not going to lose the baby. So it really did change the relationship. We were both ecstatic.
Jason was excited to be a father. I could definitely tell that this was something that he always wanted.
By the time she gave birth to their son that November, it seemed Jason and Andrea were finally hitting their stride.
We were both ecstatic. The first time holding my son, it just brought tears to my eyes.
But unfortunately, the upswing didn't last long.
I told you never to do anything like that.
One night, Andrea got upset at a comment that was made by her daughter.
I didn't do anything!
She was in the kitchen, and I just hear a crash.
Go to your room!
Andrea!
I run over, and then there's just broken glass all over the tile floor. She just had a fit of rage, and she just scared the heck out of me. So I said to her,
Give me our son! Give me our son!
Mom!
It's okay, sweetie. You'll be fine. Give me our son!
she would not hand me the baby.
With no other choice, Jason called the police, which caused Andrea to pack both kids in the car and take off.
At that point, I had no idea what she was capable of.
It was just the tip of the iceberg.
On May 2nd, 2008, Jason Witt called the police after his wife Andrea flew into a terrifying rage and took off with the kids.
I was scared because I had no idea what she was capable of. The cops picked her up a couple miles into the next county.
But Andrea told police she'd merely been taking the children to dinner.
She had kind of charmed herself out of any sort of consequences. I was beginning to learn at this point that she could lie fairly easily, readily, and people were going to believe her. I began to question the reality of the stories that she told me early on in our marriage, and I'd begun to wonder whether or not she had really been raped.
And by December 2008, Jason was even more certain that his instinct was right.
We had an argument, and Andrea had gone home to her parents, and her mom called me. And so my question to her mom was,
Did she ever get any help after her rape?
her mom's response was, huh? And I said, she was not raped, was she? And her mom's response was, you need to speak to Andrea.
When Andrea finally returned home later that night, Jason did just that.
We need to talk.
She said to me, I was married.
I didn't want you to find out.
She told me that he did rape her, but she told me that he was the son of a prominent person in town. Her parents pressured her into marrying him anyway.
Jason didn't believe a word she said.
The dam broke because everything I believed about this woman was a lie.
But despite it all, Jason wanted to somehow save the marriage. He believed that counseling was the best next step.
I was shocked. I was very vocal with Jason in telling him that she was not going to change. But Jason was committed to the relationship.
Things were good for at least a couple weeks, and she got pregnant again. I was happy, but Andrea could never follow through with counseling. So that was when I realized that I don't have a partner in this. This isn't a marriage if there's only one person fighting for it.
With that, Jason felt there was only one thing to do.
Leaving a pregnant woman was not an easy decision for me at all.
On September 4th, 2009, after 3 years of marriage, Jason filed for divorce. He hoped the worst was behind him, but he was wrong.
The day I filed for divorce was the day I basically set off a nuclear bomb.
After giving birth to a second son, Andrea fought tooth and nail to keep their children from Jason. For over 2 years, a custody battle of epic proportions played out between the two of them.
Jason and Andrea were basically sharing custody. She initiated 6 false allegations of child abuse against him with Child Protective Services, alleging all manner of child abuse. She initiated 2 or 3 police investigations against him as well.
Every month I was dealing with a new accusation. I was dealing with accusations just left and right. This was just a harrowing experience because when you're dealing with children, all she had to do was cry wolf and the courts were going to believe her.
But when all allegations against Jason were proven false, a judge finally held Andrea in contempt and ordered her to allow visitation immediately.
I knew that Andrea was backed into a corner. For the first time, someone of authority had let her know that there were truly consequences to all this stuff that she was doing.
Over the next several weeks, Jason was surprised to hear very little from his ex.
There were no accusations. It was just quiet. And it felt good. It was her weekend to have the kids. So I dropped off the kids with Andrea and I met some friends and we went out and watched the Super Bowl. After getting home, I just went straight to my bedroom and I just crashed.
But around 4 a.m., something stirred him from his sleep.
I remember hearing a shuffle right next to my bed. And I felt a crack right against my head. I can't see, it's dark. I don't know what's going on. And a big pop went off. And at that moment, I knew whoever it was had a gun.
And what he saw next would send his world spiraling out of control.
I was letting out whatever sound I could, and it was just a shriek.
In the early morning hours of February 6, 2012, Jason Witt found himself under attack.
I knew whoever it was had a gun, so I flipped the light on.
Andrea!
And Andrea is standing there, staring me down. My head was racing. I'm just wired at this point, adrenaline just running like crazy.
Turn over.
Andrea grabbed my hands and started to tie them up with plexi ties, and then began to pull the bed sheets off the bed and wrap them around me.
Andrea! No! You're gonna kill me!
I'm not gonna kill you, Jason. I love you. Stop struggling.
I couldn't breathe, and I could feel the plexi cuffs just loosening just that little bit. Eventually, I just pulled my arms out of the plexi cuffs, put a hole through the saran wrap. I started going after her, and the gun goes off. She was trying to shove her way into the room, so I started hitting her over the head with the gun. I shut the door and I locked it and called 911. I told them my ex-wife broke in. She tried to kill me. I need help. I don't know if she's still in the house. I don't know what's going on, but I need help. I need an ambulance and I need police here quick.
As police arrived, Andrea was nowhere to be found, and Jason was rushed to the emergency room. He had no clue until he arrived at the hospital that he'd been shot point blank in the face.
The bullet went through my cheek, under my ear, and out my neck, and didn't hit anything major. It's an absolute miracle.
Meanwhile, police located Andrea at a different hospital almost 4 hours away.
She told sheriff's deputies that she had been a victim of domestic violence, that her husband had beaten her with a gun.
She made claims that it was not her fault and that she was defending herself. Even after committing this horrible attack and then getting arrested at the hospital, Andrea was still lying.
It was shocking to me that she thought anyone would believe it.
Fortunately, all of Andrea's previous actions against Jason spoke volumes.
She was placed under arrest for aggravated assault for causing serious bodily injury with a deadly weapon.
Only a sick person can do this kind of thing. To walk in and torture him. God knows what her plan was. I mean, it's got to be the utmost evil.
On May 14th, 2013, Andrea went to trial, claiming she was a victim of domestic violence. But prosecutors were confident with the trail Andrea herself had left behind.
One of Andrea's boyfriends testified about the things that she had done with him that were very, very similar to what Jason had gone through. There was also evidence from a psychiatrist that she was a habitual liar. There was clear proof that Andrea had a disturbing pattern of terrorizing the men in her life.
I think Andrea is a very miserable, sad, sick individual. And it's just sad that her demons really ran so deep, she couldn't overcome them.
After 2 days of testimony, Andrea Stanley was convicted on all counts and was sentenced to 50 years in prison.
There was just a huge sense of relief. It just felt like 8 years of absolute hell was finally over.
Today, Jason continues to question everything he ever knew about Andrea.
I felt like God gave me Sergio. He made Sergio for me. He seemed very protective over Rachel and very much a man's man.
But the badge Sergio wore had little to do with honor.
Some people really are just truly bad.
And Rachel had no idea that evil had been sleeping beside her all these years.
It was monstrous. He had the wool pulled over everybody's eyes.
It was like a fire. I lost everything. Everything.
When it comes to love and marriage, things aren't always as they seem. After being adopted as a baby, Rachel Shubin felt like she had always been searching for her place in the world.
I always knew I was adopted, so it wasn't shattering, but it wasn't a good childhood. They moved a lot, my adopted family, so I was always the new kid. I felt like I didn't belong.
Rachel dreamed of settling down and having a family of her own someday.
She always wanted a stable family, something that she didn't have when she was growing up.
And in the winter of 1994, while on break from college, a chance meeting in California was about to put 18-year-old Rachel's dream in motion.
I came up to West Sacramento, my hometown, to visit my adopted family. And I went and picked up my mother coffee from the grocery store.
At the cash register, Sergio Alvarez packed up her purchases, and Rachel couldn't help but recognize him from her high school class.
Sergio, right? Sergio's very, very popular, got along really well with everyone. He was even homecoming king.
Rachel was floored when Sergio followed her out to her car and asked for her number.
So I was super flattered. This good-looking man asked me to go out with him.
It's the real number.
A few days later, the two went out for dinner. And afterward, Rachel felt herself being swept off her feet.
We went back to his house, and he played the keyboard for me. Told me he couldn't breathe without me. It was so sweet and romantic.
She found him to be very endearing and big and attractive, and it didn't take them long to fall in love.
Sergio had this giant family. I liked that he had these roots. It was the family that I'd always wanted.
The only thing that seemed off was the way Sergio shied away from intimacy.
Sergio wasn't as affectionate as I thought was normal. I just thought that was his DNA. Everyone's different.
Despite Sergio's lack of affection, Rachel knew she had met the man of her dreams. A few months after they started dating, Rachel dropped out of school and moved in with Sergio in Sacramento.
I felt like maybe because I had had such a rocky childhood that God gave me Sergio. He made Sergio for me.
With marriage in mind, Rachel got a job managing a local gift shop, and the young couple began saving money for their future. But after 2 years, they hit a speed bump when Sergio lost his job at the grocery store for constantly showing up late.
He had started getting write-ups and warnings. And so after 3, they fired him.
It wasn't my fault.
You're right.
But Sergio quickly landed on his feet when one of his friends hooked him up with a job on a ranch for troubled teens.
They needed guidance counselors, men that live there, and give them the rules and to get them used to structure, discipline. He loved that job.
The only problem was that the ranch was in Nevada, 7 hours away.
But he was gone 8 days and home 6 days. And when he's at work, he's not available. I've never minded being alone, but it was hard to be in a relationship with someone far away a lot.
With Sergio gone so much, Rachel became close to a woman who worked nearby named Kate.
She helped Kate out when Kate was working. She would watch Kate's children.
Rachel was eager for Sergio to meet her new friend, so on one of his weeks at home, Rachel invited Kate over for the evening. But later that night, Sergio made a disturbing confession to Rachel.
Your friend Kate came on to me.
Sergio tells Rachel that Kate came on to him and tried to kiss him.
She'd made a pass at him, and he had said that she called me a bitch and said,
"Why are you with her? You could do so much better."
So I felt super betrayed.
I just can't believe that. That's ridiculous.
But when Rachel confronted her friend, she heard a very different version of the story.
According to Kate, it was the other way around. Sergio tried to unbutton her blouse and tried to go even further.
He came on to me.
Rachel wasn't sure who to believe.
My friends said, she's crazy, she just wants him.
I would have thought, no way, she probably came on to him. Sergio was just an all-around good person.
No!
I ended up believing Sergio.
No!
But Rachel would soon find out that Sergio was far from the knight in shining armor he pretended to be.
Underneath it all, he was evil.
He was psychologically off.
He threw away a good life to be a monster.
I knew it.
In their 4 years together, Rachel Shubin and Sergio Alvarez had faced their share of challenges. Then, in the fall of 1998, Sergio came home from his job on a ranch in Nevada with more bad news.
What's going on? What happened?
Lost my job.
He said that a boy had made an allegation that he was too rough in one of the restraining moves that they were allowed to make on kids when they became out of hand.
Rachel, it was not my fault, all right?
Sergio was let go, and Rachel decided to just be glad he was home.
I was so relieved that he wasn't going to be gone all the time.
Luckily, someone in Sergio's large network of friends quickly helped him land a new job delivering baked goods in the neighborhood.
And he's coming home at 3 p.m. every day. The job was perfect for that time in our life. I couldn't have been happier.
In the fall of 1999, almost 5 years after they started dating, Sergio and Rachel finally wed. Within a year, the newlyweds welcomed a baby girl, and 2 years later, Rachel was pregnant again with a little boy. Sergio had given Rachel the family she'd always dreamed of.
They seemed very happy. Sergio seemed like a great father. He was always protective, always present.
But when no one was looking, that Sergio vanished.
But he was not attentive. He wasn't responsible. That attitude, it was very hard for me with the kids. They needed a responsible father.
In 2004, Rachel learned she was expecting baby number 3. Although Sergio was rarely around to help out at home, she was happy that he was at least supporting them financially. Until one day that fall, when Sergio told Rachel that his supervisor at the delivery company was unhappy with his performance.
He's being warned. He didn't take it seriously, so they suspended him. And then after careful review, decided not to bring him back.
How many times is this gonna happen?
All Rachel could think about was how they were going to get by. But Sergio had a plan.
Sergio came up with the idea of going into the police academy. He thought he could make a difference in the community. It was something he really wanted to do.
In 2007, Sergio officially became a member of the West Sacramento Police Department. He immediately put in for night patrol.
He liked working the graveyard shift. He liked catching the bad guys.
But working nights didn't ensure that Sergio spent his days with his family.
I started to notice that he was absent a lot more.
Sergio often claimed he was being called in to testify on his cases. And the extra hours were beginning to take their toll.
Rachel, what is this?
He became mean all the time. He'd bait me into arguments. I can't do anything right. It was just impossible to please him.
Rachel felt instinctually that something was off, and one night in March 2010, she discovered why.
A woman messaged me, and I didn't know who this lady was.
The woman claimed that Sergio had been deceiving Rachel, and this time, there was a shocking set of facts that not even Sergio could deny.
I'm devastated because it's true. This is real.
Look me in the eye, Sergio. Is it true?
In 2010, Rachel Alvarez received a shocking message from a woman she'd never met.
Even though I didn't know her, she said that she couldn't stand that I was being subjected to so much behind my back. She had to do the right thing. She said that Sergio was having an affair.
The woman said that Sergio had been romantically involved with one of her friends for over a year.
She had dates and times and situations that she wouldn't know unless what she was telling me were in fact true.
When Rachel confronted Sergio, he reluctantly admitted to the affair.
You're sorry.
My heart was broken.
It's been going on for a year?
He was very remorseful, said he loved only me. I'm devastated because it's true, this is real.
It'll never happen again.
Rachel struggled with what she should do, eventually deciding to put her family first and believe her husband.
That was her family structure, and that was so very important to her. So she wanted to try to make it work with him.
I wanted to give him the chance. I was willing to work past it. I loved him very much.
So over the next few months, Rachel did her best to put the past behind her and focus on her family.
He did seem to try. So I thought it was on the right track.
But by 2011, after 17 years together, it seemed to get more and more difficult to keep Sergio content, especially in the bedroom.
It seemed for him to get physical satisfaction, he had to be very aggressive. I thought he had like a guilty complex because of the affair. And so this is what it would take for him to be satisfied.
Sergio!
Rachel justified that as being, this is what my husband needs from me. This is what a wife does for her husband. I said, that doesn't seem normal, doesn't seem right to me.
Rachel did her best to please her husband until September 2012, when Sergio came home with some devastating news.
He opens up his wallet, and there's this groove where your badge goes. And I'm like, where's your badge? And he said, they put me on paid admin leave. A girl made an allegation.
They're accusing me of things that had nothing to do.
Sergio said that a woman he'd encountered on patrol had accused him of forcing himself on her.
Some to the effect that if she didn't grope him, that he would cite her. I'd give her a ticket. He said the Police Officer Association protects their officers from allegations like this because they are normal in this line of work. Why would he force someone to do something? It's very out there.
Rachel was relieved by Sergio's explanation and hoped the incident would be resolved soon. Until Sergio was unexpectedly called into the station.
I'm thinking, oh, is he in trouble? Then my doorbell rings.
Yes.
There were 6 or 7 patrol units in front of my house. I was in shock.
What is going on?
Rachel may have thought her marriage had hit rock bottom, but the real nightmare was only just beginning.
You think you know someone, but you really don't.
He would put that uniform on, and he got carried away with the power.
I think he just snapped.
In September 2012, Rachel Alvarez was horrified as an army of investigators descended on her home.
They had a search warrant with specified items that a judge had signed and given them permission to obtain. I was so terrified.
They took all of their cell phones, their computers, tablets, anything that had any kind of communication technology.
When Sergio returned, he told Rachel the allegations were more serious than he originally thought.
What's going on? What now?
They've taken DNA from him. I did not know what to think. This is all new, scary territory for me.
And after 2 months with no word from investigators, Sergio finally sat Rachel down and showed her something shocking.
It was a link to sex addiction in police officers. He told me I'm a sex addict.
I could be in a lot of trouble.
Sergio admitted he'd had many affairs during their marriage.
There's been a lot of them.
He also told her that the current police investigation hanging over his head was serious.
Please don't leave me.
Rachel was torn.
I loved him. I have a sense of loyalty to him. I don't want to be his wife, but I don't want to turn my back on him either.
Rachel reluctantly agreed to stand by him. And later that night, she tried to learn everything she could about Sergio's addiction.
In doing research to sex addiction, there are links to sexual predators' behavior. And that's when I read My Husband in Black and White.
Something clicked in her head. Looking back, she could see the different traits.
With every word, Rachel's eyes were open to the reality she'd been living in, and she thought back to Sergio's lack of intimacy and aggressiveness in bed.
But I also began to remember the allegations from early in our relationship from Kate.
He came on to me.
And thought there might actually be substance to it. So I started thinking he really was a sexual predator. That's the moment I started fearing him. I knew I needed to get out.
Over the next few months, Rachel quietly formulated a plan. And on January 3rd, 2013, she told Sergio she was taking the children out for the day. But instead, she packed up the car and fled to Florida.
She had to be scared to take her kids, drive all the way across the country. Only fear can drive a woman to do that.
And Rachel escaped not a moment too soon. 2 months later, Sergio was indicted on 35 counts, including aggravated kidnapping, rape, sexual penetration, and oral copulation by use of authority and duress.
A woman came forward and said that she had been picked up by him and felt threatened to the point that she felt she needed to perform sexual favors in exchange for not going to jail.
Eventually, investigators linked him to 5 more victims.
The charges were more than I could wrap my mind around. I was physically ill for 2 weeks.
At his trial in February 2014, Sergio pleaded not guilty, claiming the women's stories couldn't be trusted. But the prosecution argued that Sergio was a sexual predator who used his badge to hunt his victims.
He would check the system for active warrants and pick names of women that he felt he could victimize. He'd take them in his car to some remote locations, wooded lots, back alleys, and they would have sex.
Do me this favor, you won't go to jail.
With DNA and victim testimony, there was no denying the truth.
The physical evidence was overwhelming. I was just in shock.
After 2 weeks of testimony and 9 days of deliberations, Sergio Alvarez was found guilty of 25 felony counts of rape, oral copulation by duress, and aggravated kidnapping. He was sentenced to 205 years in prison.
Sergio put that uniform on, and he got carried away with the power that he had and used it against these women.
You can't prepare yourself for the father of your children and the man you give 18 years of your life to be a monster. I think there was something always wrong with Sergio. I think he just snapped.
Before the violence, before the legal battles, before the accusations that would stretch across years and reshape Jason Witt's entire understanding of his life, there was a version of Andrea Stanley that Jason genuinely believed in, a version that felt warm, intelligent, and deeply human in a way that made him feel chosen rather than merely accepted. To Jason, Andrea was not simply a partner who entered his life at the right time. She felt like an answer to a question he had been struggling with for years, the question of whether he could still find a meaningful connection after so much time spent building everything except emotional permanence. In the early days, when their conversations were still confined to messages on a screen, Andrea's personality seemed to unfold in layers that were both engaging and effortless. She wrote with humor, with emotional awareness, and with a kind of conversational confidence that made Jason feel like he was speaking to someone who truly saw him rather than simply responding to him. There was an ease in the way she expressed herself that lowered his defenses almost immediately, creating a rhythm of communication that felt natural, even intimate, long before they ever met in person. When Jason later thought back on those exchanges, he would describe them not as dramatic or overwhelming, but as comfortable, the kind of comfort that slowly replaces caution without announcing its arrival. When they eventually met face to face, that sense of ease did not disappear. Instead, it deepened. Andrea presented herself with a calm confidence, socially engaged, expressive, and attentive in a way that made Jason feel like the center of a conversation that never stalled. There was laughter, shared stories, and a conversational flow that made the passage of time feel unimportant. Jason remembered the way she listened, not just waiting for her turn to speak, but reacting, responding, and building on what he said in a way that created a feeling of connection rather than exchange. It was during this period that Jason began to form his earliest impression of who Andrea was, and that impression was overwhelmingly positive. He saw her as someone resilient, someone who had already faced hardship but had not been defined by it, someone who carried responsibility in her life as a mother while still maintaining warmth and humor in her personality. When Andrea spoke about her daughter, Jason observed a tone of seriousness that suggested care and commitment, and it reinforced his belief that she was grounded, capable, and emotionally invested in family life. The stories she shared about the father of her child, the narrative of trauma and survival, added another layer to that perception. Jason did not question it at the time. Instead, he processed it through empathy. In his mind, Andrea was not just a potential partner. She was someone who had endured something deeply damaging and had continued forward regardless. That interpretation shaped how he responded to her, often with patience and understanding, and it created a dynamic where Jason felt protective rather than critical. As their relationship developed beyond the initial dates, Jason began to experience Andrea as someone who brought emotional intensity into his life in a way that felt both stimulating and meaningful. She was expressive about her feelings, quick to communicate emotional states, and unafraid to engage in difficult conversations. For Jason, who had spent years navigating professional environments and structured goals, this emotional immediacy felt different, more personal, and at times more alive. He found himself adapting to her emotional rhythm, learning how to respond to fluctuations in mood and tone, often interpreting those changes as natural variations within a passionate relationship rather than signs of instability. There were moments of genuine joy during this period, moments where Jason felt that the relationship was not just functional, but deeply compatible. They shared humor, routines, and plans that extended beyond the present moment, creating a sense of shared trajectory that made the future feel tangible. Jason would later recall evenings where they simply talked for hours without conflict, where everything felt aligned, and where he believed he had finally found the kind of partnership that earlier relationships had failed to produce. But even within those early moments of connection, there were subtle inconsistencies that Jason did not fully recognize at the time. Andrea's emotional responses could shift quickly, sometimes within the same conversation, moving from warmth to frustration, and then back again with little visible transition. Jason often attributed these shifts to stress or external pressures, especially given her responsibilities as a mother and her work in a medical environment. He rationalized these changes as part of a complex life rather than indicators of something deeper. When Andrea became pregnant during their relationship, the emotional intensity increased significantly. Jason experienced the news as both a shock and a turning point, one that forced immediate consideration of long-term commitment. Andrea's reaction to the situation was direct and uncompromising, framing the pregnancy as a defining moment that required clarity about marriage and future stability. Jason, already emotionally invested, began to move toward acceptance of that future, not because he felt pressured in a traditional sense, but because he believed the relationship had reached a point where commitment was the logical continuation of what they had built. During this time, Jason's perception of Andrea remained largely consistent with his early impressions. He saw her as emotionally complex but sincere, someone navigating difficult circumstances while trying to maintain stability for her children and their growing family. Even when disagreements occurred, he interpreted them as situational rather than structural, believing that underlying compatibility still existed beneath the surface tension. When Andrea later experienced a reported miscarriage, Jason responded with empathy and concern, focusing on her emotional well-being rather than questioning the circumstances. The emotional impact of that event deepened his sense of responsibility toward her, reinforcing his belief that their relationship required support, patience, and commitment. It was also during this period that Jason began to take active steps toward formalizing their relationship, including symbolic gestures of commitment that reflected his desire to stabilize what had become emotionally intense and unpredictable. In Jason's mind, Andrea was not simply a partner with whom he was building a life. She was someone he was actively trying to support through trauma, loss, and emotional difficulty. That perception shaped many of his decisions during this phase of their relationship, often leading him to prioritize reassurance over confrontation. However, as time progressed, small contradictions began to accumulate. There were moments where Andrea's accounts of past events did not fully align with later conversations, subtle inconsistencies that Jason initially dismissed but would later revisit with growing doubt. At the time, these inconsistencies did not outweigh the emotional connection he felt, and so they remained unresolved in the background. Jason continued to move forward, believing that trust was something built through commitment rather than interrogation. The birth of their son marked a period of intense emotional fulfillment for Jason. In those early moments of fatherhood, he experienced a clarity of purpose that temporarily overshadowed previous uncertainties. Andrea, too, appeared to settle into the role of mother within the household structure, and for a short period, their lives seemed to align with the image Jason had envisioned when he first entered the relationship. But even then, beneath the surface of family life, the emotional patterns that had existed earlier did not disappear. They simply became more embedded in daily routines, less visible but still present. Jason's memory of Andrea during these early years is not one of constant conflict, but rather of fluctuation, moments of connection interspersed with moments of distance or tension that never fully resolved into stability. Looking back, Jason would later struggle to reconcile these two versions of Andrea, the woman he fell in love with and the woman whose actions would eventually place him in life-threatening danger. In the early stage of their relationship, those two versions were not yet in conflict. They coexisted in a way that made it possible for Jason to believe in the relationship's potential while gradually adapting to its instability. And it was within that space of belief, adaptation, and emotional investment that the foundation of everything that followed was quietly formed, long before either of them could see where it would ultimately lead. By the time Jason Witt began to fully understand that something in his marriage was fundamentally unstable, it was already too late to distinguish clearly between conflict and crisis, because the two had slowly merged into a continuous state of emotional turbulence that defined daily life inside the household. What had once been a relationship built on conversation, trust, and shared plans had gradually transformed into a pattern of unpredictable emotional escalation, where calm could exist in the morning and collapse by evening without any clear external cause. Jason often described this period not as a single breaking point, but as a series of small ruptures that accumulated until the structure of normal family life no longer felt reliable. Arguments began to take on a different tone than they had in the early years. They were no longer simply disagreements between two people trying to understand each other, but shifts in emotional intensity that left Jason feeling as though he was constantly trying to stabilize something that resisted stability. Andrea's reactions, which had once seemed expressive and emotionally engaged, began to feel increasingly volatile. A single comment could trigger an outburst that escalated far beyond the original subject, and Jason found himself adapting his behavior not to communicate more honestly, but to avoid triggering responses he could not predict. This constant adjustment created a psychological environment where Jason was no longer confident in how ordinary conversations would unfold. He began to measure his words more carefully, to anticipate emotional reactions before speaking, and to de-escalate situations before they fully formed, a pattern that slowly shifted the balance of emotional responsibility within the relationship. One of the earliest moments that marked this shift occurred during an argument that escalated rapidly inside the home. What began as a disagreement over a seemingly minor interaction involving Andrea's daughter quickly transformed into a scene of heightened emotional chaos. Jason later recalled the sensory details more than the verbal ones, the sharpness of voices echoing through the kitchen, the sudden movement of objects, and the sense that the environment itself had become unstable. In that moment, he was not analyzing the situation as a relationship conflict, but responding instinctively to a breakdown of control. When glass shattered and tension peaked, Jason's attention narrowed to one immediate concern: the safety of his infant son. The emotional atmosphere in the house shifted from domestic disagreement to something far more alarming, a state in which Jason felt that words were no longer sufficient to contain what was happening. When he asked Andrea to hand him the baby, his request was not a negotiation but an attempt to restore physical safety. Andrea's refusal to immediately de-escalate created a moment of profound psychological rupture for Jason because it forced him to confront the possibility that emotional instability in the household could directly impact their child's safety. That realization changed how he perceived the relationship from that point forward. When he called law enforcement after the situation escalated further, it was not an act of anger but of desperation, a recognition that the tools available within the relationship were no longer adequate to manage the level of conflict that had emerged. The arrival of police introduced an external authority into what had previously been an internal family system, and that shift altered the dynamics permanently. Andrea's ability to present herself differently to authorities, minimizing the severity of the incident and reframing her actions, introduced Jason to a new layer of complexity he had not previously fully grasped. It was no longer just about what happened inside the home, but about how those events could be interpreted, narrated, and understood by outsiders. That realization began to reshape Jason's perception of reality within the relationship. He started to notice that the same events could be described in different ways depending on context, and that those differences could significantly alter outcomes. This awareness introduced doubt into memories that had previously felt certain. He began revisiting earlier conversations, earlier explanations, and earlier emotional narratives with a new level of scrutiny he had not previously applied. One of the most destabilizing aspects of this period was not just the conflict itself, but the inconsistency between private experience and external presentation. In public or social contexts, Andrea could appear composed, engaging, and articulate, presenting a version of herself that did not always reflect the intensity of conflict occurring behind closed doors. Jason found this contrast increasingly difficult to reconcile because it meant that his lived experience inside the relationship was not always visible or understandable to others. This created a sense of isolation, where he could not easily validate his concerns through external confirmation. As these patterns continued, Jason began to reflect more critically on earlier parts of their relationship, particularly the origin stories that had shaped his perception of Andrea from the beginning. The narrative she had shared about her past trauma, which had initially generated empathy and trust, began to feel less stable in hindsight as inconsistencies in other areas of communication accumulated. Jason did not immediately reject those earlier beliefs, but he began to hold them with less certainty, allowing space for doubt where previously there had been acceptance. This internal shift was gradual but significant because it marked the beginning of a broader reevaluation of trust within the relationship. Around this time, Jason also became more aware of the emotional cycles that characterized their interactions. Periods of relative calm were often followed by sudden emotional escalation, creating a rhythm that was difficult to anticipate. During calm phases, Jason would sometimes regain a sense of hope, believing that stability might be returning. During escalation phases, that hope would collapse, replaced by confusion and emotional fatigue. Over time, this cycle created a psychological environment in which Jason could no longer rely on consistency as a measure of relational health. Instead, he began to live in a state of anticipation, constantly aware that any moment of peace could shift unexpectedly into conflict. The birth of their son introduced a temporary emotional anchor, but it did not resolve the underlying instability. Instead, it added new layers of responsibility that intensified existing tensions. Parenting decisions, household stress, and differing emotional responses to stress all became additional points of friction. Jason often found himself trying to separate parenting concerns from relational conflict, but over time, those boundaries blurred, making it difficult to distinguish between disagreements about family life and deeper relational instability. Despite these challenges, Jason continued to attempt stabilization. He did not initially interpret the situation as irreparable. Instead, he viewed it as a relationship under strain that required effort, patience, and structure. This belief kept him engaged in the relationship longer than external observers might have expected. Even when emotional volatility increased, he continued to look for patterns, triggers, and explanations that could restore predictability. However, the cumulative effect of repeated emotional escalation began to erode his sense of psychological safety. He started to experience the relationship not as a shared space of mutual support, but as an environment that required constant vigilance. This shift was subtle but profound because it changed how he moved through his own home, how he communicated, and how he interpreted silence. Silence was no longer neutral. It became uncertain, potentially indicative of calm or impending conflict. By the time Jason began to seriously question the long-term viability of the relationship, the emotional structure between him and Andrea had already undergone years of gradual destabilization. What remained was not a single catastrophic moment, but a long accumulation of experiences that had reshaped his understanding of trust, safety, and emotional reality. And although he could not yet see where it would ultimately lead, the foundation for the final rupture had already been fully laid, waiting for the moment when silence would no longer mean peace, but something far more dangerous. By the time the police became a recurring presence in Jason Witt's life, the situation inside his marriage had already shifted from private conflict into something far more complicated, where every incident carried the potential to be reframed, recorded, and interpreted through systems that neither Jason nor Andrea could fully control. The night Jason made the call that brought law enforcement into their home did not begin with the expectation of escalation, but with a gradual buildup of tension that had become increasingly familiar in their household. What changed on that particular night was not the existence of conflict, but its intensity and speed. An argument that might previously have remained verbal escalated rapidly into physical disruption, broken objects, and a level of emotional volatility that forced Jason to make a decision he had avoided making for years. When officers arrived, they encountered a situation that was already in motion rather than a clear beginning or end, and what they observed was filtered through the immediate behavior of those involved. Andrea, in that moment, presented herself in a composed and controlled manner, a version of herself that contrasted sharply with the emotional chaos Jason had just experienced inside the home. That contrast became one of the first major fractures in Jason's understanding of how reality could be interpreted differently depending on perspective. When Andrea left the home with the children shortly after the incident, Jason experienced not resolution but uncertainty. The physical absence of his family did not bring clarity, but instead created a void filled with unanswered questions about what would happen next and how the situation would be framed to others. When police later encountered Andrea during a traffic stop, she provided an explanation that reframed the entire incident as a misunderstanding, presenting herself as a mother simply attempting to care for her children during a stressful situation. Jason began to realize that the same event could produce entirely different narratives depending on who was telling it, and that realization introduced a new layer of psychological instability into his already strained perception of the relationship. In the days that followed, Jason found himself replaying the incident repeatedly, not only questioning what had happened, but how it could be interpreted so differently by others. This was the beginning of a deeper cognitive shift, where Jason started to separate lived experience from external perception. The gap between what he experienced inside the home and what could be communicated or believed outside of it became increasingly significant. It was also during this period that Jason began to revisit earlier parts of Andrea's history with new skepticism. The story she had told him about her past trauma, which had once been a defining element of his empathy toward her, began to feel less certain as inconsistencies in other areas of their relationship accumulated. He did not immediately reject her narrative, but he began to mentally reclassify it as something that required verification rather than acceptance. That shift marked a significant change in how Jason processed information within the relationship, moving from trust-based interpretation to analytical scrutiny. Around the same time, Jason started to notice that Andrea's emotional responses in conflict situations often included a strong focus on external perception, particularly how situations might be viewed by authorities, family members, or social circles. This awareness added another layer of complexity to Jason's understanding of their interactions, because it suggested that conflict was not only occurring between the two of them, but was also being shaped by how it might be perceived outside the relationship. This realization became especially important during moments when legal or social systems became involved, as Jason observed that narratives presented in those contexts did not always align with his personal experience. One of the most destabilizing aspects of this period was not the conflict itself, but the uncertainty surrounding truth. Jason found himself unable to rely on a consistent version of events, as explanations shifted depending on context and audience. This created a psychological environment where memory, perception, and communication no longer aligned in predictable ways. Over time, Jason began to feel that he was not only responding to events, but also constantly evaluating their authenticity. This internal process became exhausting, as it required him to question not only what was happening, but also how it would be understood later. Despite these growing doubts, Jason continued to attempt stabilization within the relationship. He did not initially view the situation as irreparable, but rather as a complex system under strain that required intervention, communication, and structure. This belief led him to pursue solutions that emphasized repair rather than separation, including attempts at counseling and structured conversation. However, these efforts were inconsistent, as Andrea's engagement with external support systems varied over time, and progress often stalled or reversed during periods of renewed emotional conflict. During one of the quieter phases following the initial police involvement, Jason experienced a brief sense of relief. The absence of immediate conflict created an illusion of stability, allowing him to believe that the situation might be de-escalating. However, this calm period did not resolve underlying issues, and instead functioned more like a temporary pause in a longer cycle of instability. Jason would later recognize this pattern as a recurring structure within the relationship, where periods of relative calm were followed by renewed tension, often without clear triggers. As time progressed, Jason became more aware of how deeply the legal system had become intertwined with their personal conflict. Each interaction with authorities, whether formal or informal, added layers of documentation and interpretation that extended beyond the private relationship. This introduced a new dimension to the situation, where personal experiences were increasingly filtered through institutional processes. Jason found this particularly challenging because it meant that resolution was no longer solely dependent on communication between him and Andrea, but also on how external systems interpreted their interactions. One of the most significant turning points during this phase occurred when Jason began to question earlier foundational beliefs about Andrea's personal history. This was not a sudden rejection, but a gradual erosion of certainty that developed as he compared past narratives with present inconsistencies. The process was emotionally complex because it required Jason to reconsider not only specific details, but also the emotional framework through which he had built trust. He began to recognize that some of the most important elements of his understanding of Andrea were based on unverified narratives that had shaped his emotional responses from the beginning of the relationship. This realization did not immediately alter his behavior, but it fundamentally changed how he interpreted past and present events. It introduced a level of cognitive distance that had not previously existed, allowing him to see the relationship not only as a participant, but also as an observer attempting to understand its structure. Even as doubt increased, Jason remained committed to the idea of preserving the family unit, particularly for the sake of his children. This commitment created an internal conflict between emotional self-protection and perceived responsibility, which influenced many of his decisions during this period. He continued to engage in efforts aimed at maintaining stability, even when evidence suggested that stability was difficult to sustain. However, as more incidents accumulated and more narratives conflicted, Jason's ability to maintain a unified understanding of his relationship weakened. He began to compartmentalize experiences, separating moments of calm from moments of conflict, without being able to fully integrate them into a coherent whole. This fragmentation of perception contributed to increasing emotional exhaustion. By the time Andrea's behavior escalated into further legal and interpersonal conflict later on, Jason was already operating within a psychological framework shaped by years of inconsistency, uncertainty, and reinterpretation of truth. What had once been a relationship grounded in emotional connection had evolved into a complex system of competing narratives, institutional involvement, and internal doubt. And although Jason could not yet see the full trajectory of where this pattern would ultimately lead, the structures that would define the final confrontation had already been firmly established in the quiet aftermath of those early calls for help, waiting for the moment when silence would no longer mean resolution, but preparation. By the time Jason would enter the most legally and emotionally exhausting phase of his marriage, the conflict between him and Andrea Stanley had evolved far beyond private disagreements or even domestic instability, becoming instead a prolonged battle of narratives that played out across courtrooms, investigations, and formal accusations that continuously reshaped the boundaries of truth. What began as a personal relationship dispute had transformed into a system of competing claims, where every interaction could potentially be reinterpreted as evidence, and every decision carried consequences that extended far beyond the home. After Jason filed for divorce in 2009, he did so with the belief that separation would bring structure and clarity, that removing the emotional entanglement would reduce the chaos that had defined the relationship for years. Instead, what followed was not resolution but escalation. The divorce did not mark the end of conflict, but the beginning of a new phase in which custody became the central axis around which every other issue revolved. From the moment legal proceedings began, Jason found himself operating in a space where personal history was no longer simply remembered or experienced, but actively reconstructed through formal allegations and counterclaims. Andrea initiated a series of accusations involving child welfare concerns, each one triggering official responses from protective services and law enforcement agencies. Jason described the experience as disorienting, not because of a single allegation, but because of the frequency and variability of them. Each claim required investigation, each investigation required explanation, and each explanation required emotional and factual defense in environments that were often procedural rather than relational. The repetitive nature of these allegations created a psychological environment in which Jason was constantly forced to respond rather than reflect, to defend rather than process. What made this phase particularly destabilizing was not only the content of the accusations, but their timing. Just as one investigation would conclude without substantiating evidence, another would begin, creating a cycle that prevented any sense of closure from forming. Jason began to feel that his identity as a father, and even as an individual, was being repeatedly placed under external examination, not in a single decisive moment, but in an ongoing series of fragmented evaluations. At the same time, Andrea's ability to present herself within these systems remained a significant factor in how situations were interpreted. Jason observed that in formal settings, Andrea often appeared composed, articulate, and credible, which contrasted sharply with the emotional volatility he experienced during private interactions. This disparity created a growing sense of frustration and confusion as he struggled to reconcile two very different versions of the same person. In one context, she was a concerned parent navigating a difficult separation, and in another, she was an individual engaged in repeated conflict escalation. The inability of external systems to fully capture this duality contributed to Jason's increasing sense of isolation within the process. Over time, Jason began to recognize that the legal system itself operated on narratives that were necessarily simplified, reducing complex relational dynamics into structured claims and responses. This simplification often meant that emotional nuance was lost and that repeated allegations, regardless of outcome, carried cumulative weight in how situations were perceived. Even when investigations did not substantiate claims, the process itself left a residual impact, both emotionally and logistically. Jason found himself repeatedly explaining, documenting, and defending aspects of his life that had previously been private and unexamined. One of the most difficult aspects of this period was the way in which uncertainty became normalized. Jason no longer experienced allegations as isolated events, but as part of an ongoing pattern that could reemerge at any time. This created a constant underlying tension in his daily life, where stability was never fully present, only temporarily implied between cycles of conflict. He began to adjust his behavior not only in response to immediate situations, but in anticipation of potential future interpretations. This anticipatory adjustment gradually reshaped how he communicated, how he documented interactions, and how he engaged with both legal and personal systems. Despite the repeated lack of substantiation in many of the allegations, the cumulative effect of the process was emotionally significant. Jason described feeling as though he was living under continuous review, where his actions were perpetually subject to reinterpretation. This experience contributed to a growing sense of fatigue that was not simply emotional, but structural, affecting how he perceived time, trust, and stability. During this period, there were moments when the system appeared to stabilize, often following court interventions or rulings that clarified custody arrangements. However, these periods of relative order were frequently short-lived, as new claims would emerge, resetting the cycle of investigation and response. Jason began to understand that resolution within this framework was not linear, but cyclical, with each conclusion carrying the potential to become the starting point of a new conflict. One of the key turning points occurred when a judge, after reviewing multiple investigations and findings, determined that previous allegations against Jason were not supported by evidence and ordered enforcement of visitation rights. For Jason, this moment represented not just a legal victory, but a rare instance of external validation within a system that had often felt ambiguous and adversarial. However, even this ruling did not fully resolve the underlying tension, as compliance and enforcement introduced new logistical and emotional challenges. Andrea's response to these rulings reflected the complexity of the situation, as periods of apparent compliance were sometimes followed by renewed resistance or further legal action. Jason began to perceive this pattern as a recurring structural feature rather than a series of isolated events. The idea that resolution could be sustained began to erode, replaced by the expectation that conflict could reemerge at any time. As this phase continued, Jason's relationship with uncertainty deepened. He was no longer only responding to present events, but also managing the psychological weight of potential future developments. This created a form of anticipatory stress that influenced how he engaged with every aspect of the custody arrangement. Even routine exchanges carried the possibility of escalation, and even periods of calm required cautious interpretation. What had once been a personal relationship had become a system of continuous negotiation, where stability was conditional and constantly subject to revision. By the time the legal battles began to show signs of slowing, Jason was already fundamentally changed by the experience. His understanding of trust had been reshaped, not by a single betrayal or incident, but by years of repeated cycles in which truth, perception, and interpretation no longer aligned in predictable ways. He had learned that in this environment, resolution was not simply about reaching agreement, but about navigating systems in which disagreement could persist indefinitely. And although he could not yet see how this prolonged period of conflict would ultimately converge into a single moment of physical violence years later, the psychological and structural conditions that would make that final confrontation possible had already been fully established within the quiet exhaustion of repeated battles that never truly ended. The night everything finally unraveled, Rachel Alvarez did not yet know that the life she had carefully built over nearly 2 decades was already sitting on the edge of collapse. The house was quiet in the way only long familiarity can make it, the kind of silence that no longer feels empty but routine, where the presence of another person nearby becomes part of the background of existence. Somewhere in that silence, her husband Sergio Alvarez moved through their home, a man she had once believed was her greatest gift, the answer to a childhood marked by instability, constant relocation, and the aching feeling of never quite belonging anywhere. For Rachel, this was supposed to be the ending of that story, not the beginning of something far darker. But in true crime, the most dangerous moments are never announced. They arrive quietly, wrapped in normality, disguised as everyday life. To understand how everything reached that point, you have to go back years, to a moment when hope still looked like love and love still looked like safety. Rachel Shubin, as she was known before marriage, grew up with a permanent sense of displacement. Adopted as a baby, she always knew she was chosen rather than born into her family, and although that knowledge was not itself painful, it carried an invisible weight. Her childhood was not defined by a single traumatic event but by instability, by frequent moves that prevented her from forming lasting roots, by classrooms where she was always the new girl, by friendships that never had enough time to fully form before they were left behind. That constant motion created a quiet emotional hunger inside her, a longing for permanence that she could not yet name but always felt. She did not just want love, she wanted belonging, something stable enough to finally stop the feeling of drifting. When she returned to West Sacramento at 18 during a college break in the winter of 1994, she was not looking for anything life-changing. She was simply visiting family, stepping briefly back into a familiar place that no longer felt fully like home. It was during an ordinary errand, standing in a grocery store line picking up coffee for her mother, that her life shifted in a way she could not have anticipated. Sergio Alvarez was working the register that day. He was known in their community, popular in high school, someone who had carried the kind of social ease that made him recognizable without effort. When he saw Rachel, something in his attention shifted. Later, she would remember the moment not as dramatic or cinematic, but as strangely simple, almost casual, yet emotionally charged in a way she could not explain. He recognized her, spoke to her, and then followed her outside. That small act, walking her to her car and asking for her number, became the beginning of a connection that would quickly accelerate beyond anything either of them had planned. Their early relationship moved with a kind of intensity that felt romantic rather than concerning. Within days, they were spending time together, and soon after, they were alone in his home, where he played music for her, spoke in a way that made her feel chosen, and said words that created emotional gravity far stronger than she had experienced before. To Rachel, who had grown up without emotional permanence, this did not feel like pressure, it felt like arrival. Sergio seemed grounded, socially confident, and deeply connected to a large family network that gave him a sense of belonging she had always wanted for herself. That family structure became one of the most attractive aspects of the relationship for her, not because of material stability, but because of emotional architecture, something she had never fully experienced growing up. There were early signs, subtle ones, that not everything about Sergio's emotional expression aligned with what she expected in intimacy. He was not consistently affectionate, not openly emotionally expressive in the way she imagined love should feel. But instead of interpreting this as a warning, Rachel interpreted it as difference, something individual rather than problematic. She told herself that people express love in different ways, that not every relationship would mirror what she had seen in stories or imagined in her mind. That interpretation allowed her to remain emotionally invested without questioning deeper compatibility. Within months, she made a decision that would define the next 18 years of her life. She left school and moved in with him. From her perspective, This was not an escape, but a step forward, a transition from uncertainty into something that felt like structure. She began working, building routines, contributing to shared goals, and gradually shifting her identity from student searching for direction to partner building a future. In those early years, despite financial challenges and Sergio's occasional instability with employment, Rachel believed they were moving in the same direction. When he lost his job at a grocery store due to repeated lateness, she did not immediately interpret it as a character flaw, but as a temporary setback. When he transitioned into work at a ranch for troubled teens in Nevada, she saw it as purpose, a role that gave him structure and meaning, even if it required long absences from home. The physical distance created emotional strain, but it also created space for adaptation, and Rachel adjusted to the rhythm of his absence and return. It was during this period of separation that external influences began to enter their lives in unexpected ways. Rachel formed a friendship with a woman named Kate, someone nearby who became part of her daily support system. Their connection was practical at first, built on proximity and shared routines, but gradually became personal. Rachel trusted her, enough to invite her into her home, enough to believe that friendship could coexist with her relationship. But this trust would soon become a source of fracture. One night, Sergio returned from his time away with a claim that Kate had behaved inappropriately toward him, that she had made advances and acted in a way that crossed boundaries. The accusation created immediate emotional shock for Rachel because it placed two trusted people in direct contradiction. When she confronted Kate, she received an entirely different version of events, one that reversed the roles and introduced accusations of inappropriate behavior from Sergio instead. Rachel found herself trapped between two conflicting narratives, each delivered with emotional certainty, each undermining the other. The psychological impact of that moment was not just confusion, but the beginning of a deeper pattern that would repeat itself later in more dangerous forms, the erosion of certainty in favor of competing truths. At the time, Rachel chose to believe Sergio, not because the decision was simple, but because her emotional investment in the relationship outweighed the emerging doubt. That choice reinforced the stability of the life she was building, but it also planted the first seeds of cognitive dissonance that would later become impossible to ignore. Over time, Sergio's job instability continued, but so did his ability to quickly transition into new roles, often through personal connections. Eventually, he entered law enforcement training and became a police officer, a role that fundamentally changed how others perceived him. The badge added authority, structure, and external credibility to his identity, reinforcing the image of a man committed to protection and order. For Rachel, this new role initially seemed to confirm what she had always believed about him, that he was responsible, disciplined, and capable of providing stability for their growing family. They married in 1999, and within a few years, their household expanded with children, transforming their relationship into a full family structure that appeared, from the outside, complete and functional. But inside that structure, emotional inconsistencies persisted. Sergio's presence in the home was not always consistent, not always emotionally engaged, and over time Rachel began to notice that the version of him she saw as a father and husband did not always align with the version she saw in moments of tension or absence. Still, she remained committed to the idea of family, believing that stability was something built through endurance rather than perfection. What she did not yet know was that the stability she was trying to preserve was already being undermined by patterns she could not yet fully see, patterns that would eventually reshape everything she believed about the man she married. For Rachel Alvarez, the early years of marriage did not feel like a dramatic shift away from the life she had imagined, but rather like a gradual tightening of responsibility around a structure she believed was still fundamentally sound. She and Sergio built a household that, from the outside, appeared stable enough to pass as ordinary. There were children, routines, work schedules, and the familiar rhythm of domestic life that gives the impression of continuity even when internal dynamics are more complicated. Rachel often described this period as one of adjustment rather than crisis, where the main challenges were logistical, not emotional. Sergio worked, sometimes inconsistently, but he was present in ways that reinforced the idea of a traditional family structure. When he was home, He carried himself with authority, a presence that filled the space in a way Rachel interpreted as protection rather than control. In public settings, he maintained a social confidence that made him appear reliable, even respected, and this external perception reinforced Rachel's belief that she had chosen a stable partner. Yet beneath that surface, small behavioral inconsistencies began to emerge, not in a way that immediately demanded attention, but in patterns that became more noticeable over time. Sergio's work life, for example, was marked by a series of transitions that Rachel initially rationalized as normal instability in early adulthood. He lost a job due to repeated lateness, something he accepted with apology rather than resistance, and quickly transitioned into a position at a ranch for troubled teens. To Rachel, this shift appeared meaningful, even redemptive, as if he had found purpose in a role that required discipline and structure. The fact that the job required him to be away from home for extended periods created emotional strain, but Rachel adapted, telling herself that absence was part of sacrifice, that providing for a family sometimes meant physical distance. During these periods, she managed the household alone, raising their children while Sergio worked in Nevada for days at a time. She described herself as someone who had become comfortable with solitude, but beneath that adaptation was a growing emotional imbalance that she did not yet fully recognize. When Sergio was present, his behavior often carried a different kind of intensity. He could be attentive, engaged, and even affectionate in ways that reassured Rachel of their bond, but there were also moments where his emotional distance felt abrupt, as if he were physically present but internally elsewhere. These contrasts did not yet form a coherent pattern in Rachel's mind, but they contributed to an underlying sense of unpredictability in their relationship. Around this time, Rachel also began forming a close friendship with a woman named Kate, someone who worked nearby and became part of her daily support system. The friendship initially served a practical and emotional function, offering companionship during Sergio's absences and creating a sense of community in an otherwise isolated routine. Rachel trusted Kate enough to involve her in her life, including interactions with her children, and this trust reinforced her belief that her world was stable and socially supported. However, this period of relative normalcy would soon be disrupted by an incident that introduced the first major rupture in her perception of Sergio's character. One evening, after Sergio returned from his time away, he told Rachel that Kate had made an inappropriate advance toward him, claiming that she had attempted to kiss him and behaved in a way that crossed personal boundaries. The accusation immediately destabilized Rachel's understanding of both relationships because it placed two trusted figures in direct conflict. When she confronted Kate, the response she received did not align with Sergio's account. According to Kate, the situation had been reversed, with Sergio allegedly initiating inappropriate physical contact and attempting to escalate the interaction beyond acceptable limits. Rachel suddenly found herself trapped between two conflicting narratives, each delivered with emotional conviction, each undermining the credibility of the other. The psychological effect of this contradiction was not just confusion, but a forced confrontation with uncertainty in a space where she had previously assumed clarity. She attempted to reconcile the discrepancy by seeking validation from others, but the responses she received only deepened the ambiguity. Friends suggested that Kate might have ulterior motives, that she could be misinterpreting or exaggerating the situation, while others hinted that Sergio's behavior might not be as straightforward as he presented it. In the absence of clear evidence, Rachel made a decision that would become a recurring pattern in her life. She chose to believe Sergio. That decision was not made lightly, but it was shaped by emotional investment, trust built over years, and the desire to preserve the structure of her family. Accepting Sergio's version of events allowed her to maintain continuity in her understanding of her relationship, even if it required suppressing lingering doubt. Over time, the incident faded into the background of daily life, but it did not disappear entirely. Instead, it became part of an unresolved layer of memory that would later resurface in different contexts. As Sergio continued working in law enforcement, his identity began to shift in ways that were externally reinforced by authority. Wearing a badge introduced a new dimension to how he was perceived by others, granting him a position of institutional trust that extended beyond personal relationships. For Rachel, this development initially strengthened her belief in him. The role of police officer carried symbolic weight, representing discipline, protection, and social responsibility, and it aligned with the image she had formed of him as a capable and protective partner. However, as time passed, Rachel began to notice changes in his behavior that were not immediately attributable to any single cause. Sergio's emotional tone at home became more inconsistent. There were periods where he seemed distant, irritable, or easily provoked, followed by intervals of relative calm where family life resumed a familiar rhythm. Rachel initially attributed these fluctuations to job stress, particularly given the demands of night shifts and the psychological weight often associated with law enforcement work. But over time, the emotional contrast between his public role and private behavior became more difficult to ignore. In public, Sergio maintained composure and authority, while in private, he sometimes exhibited frustration that seemed disproportionate to the situation at hand. This duality created an internal conflict for Rachel because it challenged the coherence of the identity she had built around him. One of the most significant turning points in this phase occurred when Rachel discovered evidence of infidelity through an unexpected message from a woman she did not know. The message contained specific details about an affair that extended over a long period of time, including references to meetings, timelines, and personal interactions that could not easily be dismissed as rumor or misunderstanding. When Rachel confronted Sergio, he initially resisted but eventually admitted to the affair. The confirmation shattered Rachel's emotional stability, not only because of the betrayal itself, but because it forced her to reinterpret years of shared history through a new lens. Everything she had believed about emotional consistency and loyalty within the marriage suddenly became uncertain. In the aftermath of this revelation, Rachel experienced a period of emotional collapse followed by a decision to remain in the relationship. That decision was driven by a combination of practical concerns, emotional attachment, and a deeply rooted desire to preserve the family structure she had worked so hard to build. She chose reconciliation over separation, not because trust had been restored, but because leaving felt like dismantling the only stable environment her children had known. Over time, attempts were made to repair the relationship, but the underlying foundation had already been altered. Trust, once fractured, did not fully return to its original state. Instead, it existed in a modified form, where suspicion and hope coexisted uneasily. Rachel began to observe Sergio's behavior with greater scrutiny, particularly in moments of emotional intensity or physical interaction. What once felt like isolated incidents now began to form a pattern in her perception, though she struggled to determine whether that pattern reflected reality or heightened awareness. As the years progressed, the relationship became increasingly defined by cycles of tension and temporary reconciliation. Rachel found herself adapting to emotional unpredictability as a normal condition of marriage rather than an exception. And although she did not yet realize it, this gradual normalization of instability would become one of the most important psychological foundations for everything that would eventually follow, long before any criminal investigation, any legal accusation, or any irreversible moment forced her to confront the full reality of the man she had once believed was her safest place in the world. From the outside, Rachel Alvarez's life looked like the kind of story people point to as stability finally achieved, a young woman who had grown up without roots building a family of her own, raising children, maintaining a home, and standing beside a husband who wore a badge and carried the image of authority in his community. But inside that life, the reality was far more fragmented, shaped by emotional cycles that rarely aligned with the image presented to the world. For Rachel, motherhood did not arrive as a single transformative moment, but as a gradual accumulation of responsibility layered on top of an already complicated marriage. When her first child was born, she experienced a kind of emotional grounding she had never felt before, a sense of purpose that gave structure to the instability she had grown accustomed to in her adult life. Sergio, in those early moments of fatherhood, appeared engaged and present, holding the child, participating in family life, and reinforcing Rachel's belief that whatever difficulties existed between them could be managed within the broader framework of family commitment. But even in those early stages of parenting, there were inconsistencies that Rachel noticed, but did not yet fully interpret as warning signs. Sergio's involvement in daily family life fluctuated depending on his work schedule and emotional state. At times, he was attentive, taking an active role in household routines, engaging with the children, and participating in family activities with apparent ease. At other times, he withdrew emotionally, becoming distant or irritable without clear explanation, leaving Rachel to manage both the emotional and practical demands of parenting alone. She adapted to this imbalance by internalizing responsibility, convincing herself that flexibility was part of marriage, especially in a household where one partner worked irregular hours in law enforcement. When their second child was born, the demands on Rachel increased significantly, and the structure of their household became more dependent on her ability to maintain stability during Sergio's absences. She began to operate in a constant state of multitasking, balancing childcare, household management, and emotional regulation within a relationship that no longer felt consistently reciprocal. Yet even during this period of increased pressure, Rachel still held on to the belief that Sergio's underlying role in the family was protective and stable. His identity as a police officer reinforced that perception, creating an external framework of legitimacy that made it difficult to fully reconcile private inconsistencies with public image. In the community, Sergio was seen through the lens of authority, someone who enforced order, someone who represented structure. That external validation played a significant role in how Rachel interpreted the challenges within their marriage, often leading her to contextualize personal difficulties as situational rather than structural. However, as time passed, emotional strain within the household became more difficult to compartmentalize. Sergio's mood shifts became more pronounced, and arguments that once resolved quickly began to escalate more frequently and with greater emotional intensity. Rachel found herself increasingly cautious in how she communicated, often anticipating potential reactions before expressing herself fully. This anticipatory behavior gradually altered the emotional dynamic between them, creating a pattern where communication became less about openness and more about avoiding escalation. One of the most difficult aspects of this period was the way emotional volatility began to feel normalized. Rachel no longer experienced conflict as an exception to stability, but as part of the expected rhythm of the relationship. Periods of calm were followed by tension, and tension was followed by temporary reconciliation, creating a cycle that repeated without clear resolution. Within this cycle, Rachel began to question not only specific incidents, but the broader structure of her marriage. She started to notice that explanations for behavior often shifted depending on context, and that accountability was difficult to establish consistently. These realizations did not immediately lead to confrontation, but they accumulated quietly, forming an internal sense of uncertainty that she did not fully articulate at the time. During this phase, Sergio's professional identity continued to play a significant role in shaping external perception. His position in law enforcement created a public image of discipline and authority that contrasted with the emotional instability Rachel experienced at home. This contrast created a form of psychological dissonance for Rachel because it required her to reconcile two competing realities: the respected officer in public and the inconsistent partner in private. That dissonance made it more difficult for her to fully articulate concerns to others, as she often felt that her internal experience would not align with external expectations of who Sergio was supposed to be. The turning point in Rachel's perception began to form gradually rather than through a single event. It emerged through a series of interactions, inconsistencies, and emotional experiences that collectively undermined her confidence in the stability of the relationship. One of the most significant contributing factors was Sergio's increasing emotional intensity during conflicts, which at times escalated beyond verbal disagreement into behavior that left Rachel feeling psychologically overwhelmed. She began to notice that certain patterns of interaction repeated themselves, particularly in moments where Sergio's frustration appeared disproportionate to the situation. At the same time, Rachel's own responses began to change. She found herself becoming more cautious, more measured, and increasingly aware of potential consequences when expressing disagreement. This shift was not immediate, but developed over time as she adjusted to the emotional environment within the household. As years passed, the accumulation of these experiences began to reshape Rachel's internal understanding of her marriage. What had once been perceived as normal relational challenges began to take on a different quality, one that felt less like temporary difficulty and more like systemic instability. However, despite growing internal doubts, Rachel continued to prioritize family structure, particularly the well-being of her children. This prioritization often influenced her decision-making, leading her to remain within the relationship even when emotional clarity was lacking. The presence of children created a strong anchoring effect, reinforcing the importance of maintaining household continuity despite internal uncertainty. During this period, external events occasionally interrupted the cycle of domestic tension, including moments where Sergio's professional role became directly involved in household stress. Allegations and investigations related to his work created additional layers of pressure that extended beyond the family unit, bringing institutional attention into their private lives. These events intensified Rachel's emotional burden, as she found herself navigating not only personal conflict but also external scrutiny. Each new development required adaptation, explanation, and emotional resilience, further embedding her within a system of ongoing instability. Over time, Rachel began to recognize that her marriage was no longer defined by a single narrative of stability or instability, but by a continuous fluctuation between the two. This realization did not immediately lead to separation or decisive action, but it fundamentally altered her internal perception of the relationship. She began to understand that the emotional environment she was living in was not temporary, but persistent, shaped by patterns that had repeated over years without resolution. Even as she continued to maintain the structure of family life, attending to daily responsibilities and supporting her children, an underlying awareness began to develop that the foundation of her marriage was no longer secure in the way she had once believed. This awareness remained largely unspoken, existing beneath the surface of daily routines, but it would become increasingly significant as later events unfolded, eventually forcing Rachel to confront the full extent of the reality she had been gradually adapting to for years without fully naming it. The first time Rachel Alvarez truly felt fear inside her own marriage, it did not arrive as a single dramatic moment, but as a gradual escalation that transformed an ordinary domestic evening into something unstable, unpredictable, and deeply unsettling. It began like so many other arguments in their home, triggered by something small, something that in a healthy relationship would have been resolved through conversation or simply left to pass. But in the Alvarez household, small triggers often carried the weight of larger unresolved tensions, and on that night, the emotional pressure that had been building for years finally broke through the surface in a way that could not be contained. Voices rose faster than usual, not immediately explosive but quickly intensifying, moving through stages that Rachel had learned to recognize but never fully predict. There was a moment where she still believed it might resolve itself, where she still thought this was another cycle that would end in silence and temporary distance before returning to routine. But something about Sergio's demeanor that night felt different, sharper, more focused in a way that made the air inside the house feel heavier. Rachel later described it not as a single action that changed everything, but as a shift in energy, as if the emotional temperature of the room had dropped without warning. Objects were not yet broken, but tension had reached a level where every movement felt charged with potential consequence. Their children were nearby, and that alone changed how Rachel processed the situation. She was no longer thinking only about the argument itself, but about containment, about preventing escalation from spilling into a space where it could affect them directly. When she attempted to redirect the situation, to de-escalate or separate emotionally, it did not produce the expected effect. Instead, it seemed to intensify Sergio's frustration, as if her attempts at calm were being interpreted through a different emotional lens. The argument shifted from verbal exchange into physical presence, with Sergio moving through the space in a way that made Rachel increasingly aware of proximity, of control, of the narrowing of options. At a certain point, she realized that the argument was no longer about the original issue, whatever it had been, but about power, control, and emotional dominance within the space they shared. That realization created a physiological response in her, a kind of internal alert that she had never fully experienced in earlier years of the relationship. When an object finally broke, the sound was not just noise, it was a rupture in the fragile structure of the evening. That moment changed Rachel's perception instantly, because it introduced physical consequences into what had previously been emotional conflict. She moved instinctively toward her child, not as part of a planned response, but as a reflex rooted in protection. In that moment, the relationship dynamic shifted in a way that could not be reversed. When she asked Sergio to hand over their child, it was no longer just a request within a domestic disagreement, but a line of separation between safety and instability. Sergio's refusal or resistance in that moment created a psychological fracture for Rachel because it forced her to confront the possibility that access to her own child could be contested within the emotional structure of the household. That realization did not fully form in language at the time, but it registered as instinct, as urgency, as a narrowing of focus toward immediate safety. When law enforcement became involved later, it was not the beginning of conflict, but the external recognition of a situation that had already escalated beyond private resolution. The presence of police officers introduced a new dimension into the household dynamic, one where perception, documentation, and interpretation became as important as the events themselves. Rachel experienced this shift as disorienting because the internal reality of what she had just lived through did not fully align with how it was being externally processed. In the aftermath of that incident, Sergio's behavior during official interactions added another layer of complexity. He was able to present himself in a controlled and composed manner, offering explanations that reframed the situation in ways that reduced immediate consequences. To Rachel, this created an unsettling contrast between what she had experienced internally and what was being communicated externally. It was the first time she began to fully understand that the same event could exist in multiple versions depending on who was telling the story and in what context. This realization did not immediately change her emotional attachment to Sergio, but it introduced doubt into the reliability of shared reality. In the days that followed, she found herself replaying the incident repeatedly, not just emotionally but analytically, trying to understand where perception diverged from interpretation, where communication broke down, and how two people could experience the same moment so differently. This internal processing created a form of psychological fragmentation, where memory was no longer a single narrative, but a set of competing interpretations. At the same time, daily life continued, and the household did not immediately dissolve into separation. Instead, there was a return to routine that felt both familiar and uneasy, as if the incident had been temporarily contained but not resolved. Rachel resumed her responsibilities, caring for her children, managing the home, and interacting with Sergio within the same physical space, but the emotional baseline had shifted. There was now an additional layer of awareness in her interactions, a sense that boundaries had been tested and that those boundaries were not as fixed as she had previously believed. One of the most significant psychological effects of this period was the emergence of anticipatory awareness. Rachel began to monitor not only what was happening, but what could potentially happen, reading emotional cues in advance and adjusting her behavior accordingly. This created a subtle but continuous form of internal stress because it required constant emotional assessment even in moments of relative calm. Over time, this anticipation became normalized, blending into daily life in a way that made it difficult to distinguish between genuine stability and managed avoidance of escalation. As she continued to reflect on the incident, earlier memories began to shift in meaning. Interactions that once seemed isolated or explainable began to feel connected, forming a pattern that suggested repetition rather than randomness. However, Rachel did not immediately interpret this pattern as definitive, because doing so would require reevaluating the entire structure of her relationship, including years of decisions, commitments, and emotional investments. Instead, she held these observations in a suspended state, neither fully accepting nor rejecting them. The introduction of law enforcement into their domestic conflict also had long-term implications for how future interactions would be perceived. It established a precedent that external systems could become involved in private disputes and that those systems would interpret events through their own frameworks rather than the emotional context of the relationship. This awareness added a new dimension to Rachel's thinking because it meant that future conflicts were no longer confined to the private sphere. As time passed, the memory of that night did not fade, but rather integrated into Rachel's broader understanding of her marriage as a turning point in emotional structure. It marked the point where conflict was no longer just relational, but had the potential to become externalized, documented, and interpreted beyond the household. Even though life continued afterward, with periods of calm returning in between moments of tension, Rachel no longer experienced those calm periods in the same way. They were no longer purely restful, but carried an awareness that stability was conditional, not guaranteed. And without fully realizing it at the time, she had crossed a threshold in which her understanding of safety, trust, and emotional predictability within her own home had been permanently altered, setting the stage for conflicts that would escalate far beyond anything she could yet foresee. The morning after the incident, the house did not feel like it had returned to normal, even though nothing on the surface suggested immediate catastrophe. There were no visible signs of permanent damage, no lingering presence of law enforcement, no physical markers that would immediately signal danger to an outsider walking through the space. And yet for Rachel Alvarez, the environment had fundamentally changed. It was not the objects in the house that felt different, but the meaning of the space itself. The same kitchen where she had prepared meals for her children, the same hallway where daily routines unfolded, now carried a subtle but persistent weight of memory that altered how she moved through it. Every sound felt slightly amplified, every silence slightly more loaded, as if the house itself was holding on to what had happened the night before. Sergio acted as though the situation was already behind them. He moved through the day with a kind of controlled normalcy, returning to routine, speaking in familiar tones, resuming behaviors that suggested continuity rather than rupture. But Rachel found herself unable to fully re-enter that version of normal life. Her internal experience had shifted too dramatically to simply reset. She noticed details she might have previously ignored, not because they were new, but because her perception of them had changed. The way Sergio looked at her during brief exchanges, the way he responded to questions with varying degrees of intensity, the way silence felt different depending on the time of day. These were not dramatic revelations in themselves, but they accumulated into a pattern of heightened awareness that she could not easily turn off. In the days that followed, law enforcement involvement introduced a new layer of structure into their lives. Statements had to be processed, accounts had to be reviewed, and interpretations of events had to be aligned with external procedures. For Rachel, this created an additional psychological burden because it required her to articulate experiences that had already felt difficult to fully process internally. Describing the incident in formal terms forced her to reduce something emotionally complex into structured language, and in doing so, she became increasingly aware of the gap between lived experience and documented narrative. Sergio, meanwhile, was able to navigate these interactions with a level of composure that contrasted with Rachel's internal state. He presented explanations that emphasized context, intention, and interpretation, framing the incident in a way that reduced its perceived severity. To outside observers, this contributed to a version of events that felt more contained, more structured, and less emotionally volatile than Rachel's internal recollection. This discrepancy created a growing sense of dissonance for her because it meant that her experience was not fully reflected in the external narrative being constructed around them. As the investigation process unfolded, Rachel began to notice how easily the same event could be reframed depending on emphasis and perspective. Small differences in wording changed the emotional weight of descriptions, and those differences influenced how the situation was perceived by others. This realization was not immediately dramatic, but it introduced a quiet instability into her understanding of truth within relational conflict. She began to understand that memory was not a fixed record, but something that could be shaped, interpreted, and presented in different forms depending on context. At home, the emotional atmosphere remained tense but functional. There were periods of silence that felt neither peaceful nor hostile, but suspended, as if both individuals were waiting for something unresolved to either escalate or dissolve. Rachel found herself adjusting her behavior in subtle ways, choosing words more carefully, avoiding certain topics, and monitoring emotional cues with increased attention. This adjustment was not conscious strategy, but adaptive response to uncertainty. One of the most significant developments during this period was Rachel's increasing difficulty in reconciling Sergio's public identity with her private experience of him. In professional settings, particularly those related to his role in law enforcement, he maintained a level of authority and control that reinforced external trust. People responded to him with respect, and his position carried institutional validation that shaped how he was perceived in broader contexts. For Rachel, this created a psychological tension because it meant that her internal experience of instability existed alongside a public narrative of competence and reliability. That contradiction made it difficult for her to fully articulate concerns without feeling that they might be dismissed or misunderstood. As time passed, the emotional impact of the incident began to shift from immediate shock to longer-term reflection. Rachel started to revisit earlier moments in the relationship, not as isolated memories, but as potential indicators of a larger pattern. Situations that had once been interpreted individually now began to form a sequence in her mind, suggesting continuity rather than randomness. However, this emerging pattern did not immediately lead to clarity. Instead, it created additional uncertainty because it required her to reconsider the meaning of years of shared experience without having a clear framework for reinterpretation. During this phase, she also became more aware of how conflict had previously been normalized within the relationship. What once might have been considered escalation now appeared as part of a broader behavioral cycle, where intensity rose and fell without clear resolution. This recognition did not immediately change her emotional attachment, but it altered how she understood the structure of the relationship itself. Stability was no longer something she assumed existed beneath the surface of conflict, but something that had to be actively evaluated and maintained. At the same time, daily responsibilities continued, particularly those related to parenting. Rachel remained focused on maintaining consistency for her children, ensuring that routines were preserved even as her internal emotional state shifted. This external stability contrasted sharply with her internal uncertainty, creating a dual experience where outward normalcy coexisted with internal reevaluation. Sergio's behavior during this time remained variable. There were moments of apparent calm, where interactions felt manageable and familiar, followed by periods where emotional distance or tension reemerged without clear cause. Rachel began to anticipate these shifts, not in a predictive sense, but as possibilities that had to be accounted for in daily interaction. This anticipatory awareness gradually became a defining feature of her emotional environment, shaping how she approached even routine conversations. One of the most important psychological changes during this period was Rachel's increasing awareness of how quickly perception could shift depending on context. She observed that the same behavior could be interpreted differently depending on timing, emotional framing, and external narrative structure. This understanding introduced a level of uncertainty into her perception of reality that extended beyond the immediate incident and into broader aspects of her relationship. Even as external processes eventually moved forward and immediate legal attention decreased, the internal impact of the event remained. It had altered her baseline perception of safety, trust, and predictability within her own home. And although life continued in outwardly recognizable forms, the internal framework through which Rachel experienced her marriage had already been permanently reshaped, leaving her in a space where stability was no longer assumed, but constantly questioned, even in moments that appeared calm on the surface. By the time doubts began to take clearer shape in Rachel Alvarez's mind, they did not arrive as a single accusation or a sudden moment of certainty. They arrived as fragments, scattered across years of experience, each one too small on its own to demand immediate action, but together forming a pattern she could no longer fully ignore. What had once been interpreted as emotional inconsistency, job stress, or marital strain began to feel more structured in hindsight, as if earlier explanations no longer fully accounted for what she had lived through. Yet even as this awareness developed, Rachel found herself trapped in a psychological space that made decisive clarity difficult. Sergio was not only her husband, but also the father of her children, the man she had built her adult life around, and a figure whose public identity carried institutional authority that made contradiction feel dangerous and isolating. When the first formal allegation connected to Sergio's professional life began to surface, Rachel did not immediately interpret it as confirmation of her growing internal doubts. Instead, she experienced it as disruption, something external entering a system she had already been struggling to stabilize internally. The allegation involved a woman claiming inappropriate conduct during a law enforcement interaction, a scenario that immediately introduced legal scrutiny into Sergio's career. For Rachel, the initial explanation she received was framed in procedural terms, emphasizing misunderstanding, context, and institutional protections that exist within policing environments. She was told that allegations of this nature were not uncommon, that officers were often subjected to claims that could be difficult to interpret without full investigation. This framing created an immediate tension for Rachel because it positioned the situation within a professional context she did not fully understand, while also requiring her to reconcile it with her private experience of Sergio's behavior. At home, Sergio appeared increasingly defensive, but also controlled in his presentation of events. He emphasized procedural processes, legal safeguards, and institutional structures that he claimed would resolve the situation in his favor. For Rachel, this introduced a new dimension of uncertainty, because it meant she was now required to interpret not only personal behavior, but also institutional narratives. As the situation escalated, law enforcement investigators began to formally engage with Sergio's case, and the presence of official scrutiny introduced a level of seriousness that could not be dismissed as rumor or misunderstanding. Search warrants were executed, and personal devices were seized, including phones and computers. For Rachel, this moment was disorienting, not only because of the intrusion into her private life, but because of the sudden collapse of separation between public identity and private reality. The man she had lived with for years was now being examined through a lens that extended far beyond family dynamics. During this period, Rachel's internal conflict intensified. She was confronted with two competing frameworks of interpretation. One was rooted in her lived experience of emotional inconsistency, past conflicts, and unresolved incidents that had accumulated over time. The other was shaped by Sergio's explanations, institutional narratives, and external assurances that framed the situation as manageable and potentially exaggerated. Navigating between these frameworks created a state of sustained cognitive tension, where certainty was continually delayed by the need to reconcile conflicting information. As investigators continued their work, Rachel was introduced to additional information that further complicated her understanding. References to behavioral patterns, allegations of prior misconduct, and contextual interpretations of Sergio's actions began to surface in fragmented forms. None of this information was initially presented as definitive conclusion, but rather as part of an ongoing investigation. Still, its presence had a cumulative psychological effect. It forced Rachel to revisit earlier experiences with a new interpretive lens, reconsidering past events not as isolated incidents, but as potential indicators of a broader pattern she had not fully recognized at the time. One of the most destabilizing aspects of this period was the realization that perception itself could be influenced by authority, context, and narrative framing. Rachel observed how different accounts of the same situation could coexist without immediate resolution, each supported by its own structure of credibility. This made it increasingly difficult for her to rely on instinct alone, because instinct was no longer aligned with certainty. Instead, it existed alongside doubt, shaped by new information that challenged previous assumptions. At home, the emotional environment became increasingly strained. Conversations were often limited, and when they occurred, they carried an undercurrent of unresolved tension. Sergio maintained his position that the allegations were misunderstandings or misinterpretations of professional interactions, while Rachel struggled to determine how much of what she had previously experienced in their marriage should be reinterpreted in light of this new information. This internal reevaluation did not happen all at once, but developed gradually as memories began to reorganize themselves around emerging possibilities. As the investigation progressed, Rachel also became aware of how isolated her position had become. Much of the information being exchanged existed outside of her direct control, filtered through legal processes, institutional procedures, and professional interpretations. This created a sense of distance between her lived experience and the unfolding official narrative, a distance that made it difficult to feel fully anchored in either version of reality. The uncertainty did not remain abstract for long. It began to influence her daily behavior, her emotional responses, and her sense of safety within her own home. Situations that once would have been interpreted as routine now carried additional weight, as if every interaction contained potential significance beyond its immediate context. This heightened awareness created emotional fatigue, as Rachel found herself continuously processing information without resolution. Over time, she began to notice that the accumulation of unresolved concerns was no longer sustainable. The emotional structure she had relied on for years, based on adaptation and endurance, was no longer sufficient to maintain stability in the face of expanding uncertainty. Even though no single moment provided absolute clarity, the direction of her internal perception began to shift. She started to recognize that the uncertainty she was experiencing was not temporary, but structural, embedded within the history of her relationship and reinforced by new external developments. Eventually, this realization reached a point where remaining in the same environment was no longer psychologically viable. The decision to leave did not emerge from certainty, but from accumulated fear, doubt, and the need to protect herself and her children from an environment that no longer felt predictable. When she finally made the choice to separate herself physically from Sergio, it was not framed in her mind as resolution, but as necessity. She left not because she had all the answers, but because staying no longer allowed space for safety or clarity. And in that departure, she crossed a threshold that transformed uncertainty into action, marking the beginning of a new phase in which the full reality of what had been happening in her life would begin to emerge through legal processes that would ultimately redefine everything she thought she knew about the man she had once believed was her partner, protector, and family.